published.
When a woman does it to another woman, it's not mansplaining. What is it?
Perfect.
That was so good. All right, so you're published. Cool.
I was going to use a different word, but that was much better.
At the end of it, you'll have the option to save, and you want to say yes to all of it.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah, I was going to leave one question.
Yeah.
Take it slow. This book is dangerous. Fox socks, box knocks, knocks and box, fox and socks, knocks on fox and socks and box.
Okay, Katie is probably. Hey, Katie. Hey. We have. Would you like to see the insane speaker that we have to make sure that your voice? I actually was just like. Can somebody? We were showing the video of the guy who raps the Dr. Zeus videos to Dr. Dre beats. Yeah. So I could share it, but I feel like it might be in tension with our purposes here today. So, okay, let me see if I can.
Putting the catechesis to Dr. Dre beats.
That's a great idea. Can we get extra credit if we do
Catechesis to
that?
Dr. Dre beats. Okay, I want to see if I can make your face change layouts. Here we go.
There was.
Say, there we go. Okay, so Katie, we have you up on the screen, and then so you're front and center, basically,
And really loud, too.
and really loud,
It's
and
stereo.
and especially the sort of deep timbres in your voice will come forth in all of their gloriousness here with the speaker we have. So
In technicolor.
yes, your video quality, you know, it's okay. Your audio quality, outrageous.
Can I show her a video of how big she is?
Yeah. Do you want to? Yeah.
Can you see my?
Your nose is as... Oh, wait. Here. Your nose is as big as Audrey.
Your nose is as big as Audrey. Your nose is
Go back to your face. Go back to your face. Katie, say something so the speaker takes you.
Say something.
There we go.
Do like in cover order. There's like a little pin.
That's how big you are.
There's a way to pin her. So you can pin Dr. Knox. There's a way to pin her though.
Oh.
So that she's always up there.
That's what I. Okay.
Drop down. Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Katie is now.
This is mansplaining.
Okay.
Yeah.
The silent view.
Okay. We getting the? We're still getting the echo.
Somebody has their. David has their.
Okay. Does everybody have their microphone and their audio off?
Yes.
Let's try this again. We good? No feedbacks? Can you hear me,
Do you
Katie?
hear me?
Yes? Well, you and I can have a conversation. I don't know about anybody else. So I think the deal is that when you want to talk, I will unmute and you will mute. Or I will mute, you will unmute, and then we will go back and forth. Make sense? Yeah? Okay.
Clear as your face shield.
Watch yourself. Okay.
Yes, wait, what makes liturgics and pastoral ministry different?
What makes liturgics and pastoral ministry different?
Well, you don't wear the shield.
Oh, well, it's because other people have been talking.
Oh.
So when I teach, I'll wear the shield. Yeah, I have one. I kind of wish you could get one that, like, if you pressed a button, it would look like Captain America's shield, like it would become opaque, and then it would like go back to being see-through.
So that would be.
I think that would be fun.
The Spider-Man Mysterio.
Yes. Okay. Why don't we hand this over to Katie? Katie, do you wanna pray for us?
Sure. I'm gonna feedback myself. Okay. Dear Lord, I pray that you would guide our conversation this morning, that you would lay on our hearts those congregations that we are led to form and shape, and that you would guide our conversation and our hearts in love for them. Amen.
Amen.
So our reading from today, sorry, I have to go really slow because I'm hearing myself.
Is that better?
So grounded in the gospel, our reading today was from the introduction and the first chapter. And I thought it might be helpful. I sent you all my discussion and questions, just not so that you could start thinking in advance, but just in case we had any technology issues. So if you want to, you can go ahead and pull those up. But if you don't have them, I wanted to start out by maybe having us reflect on our own experiences of catechesis from the churches where we grew up, and maybe think a bit about our own formation process and what we found the most helpful. And perhaps if you're like me, you didn't have the best catechesis process, and so you might actually have some experiences that were negative, and perhaps reflect a little bit about the learning that came out of that. So just take a few minutes and reflect on our own experiences of catechesis.
Why don't we go around the room? Why don't we start with Mark, and then you can unmute, and yeah.
Right on. Okay.
Okay.
Keep that. There we go. Okay, that should be better. Yeah, so I didn't grow up in church, so I didn't grow up being catechized. That's the first part. But when I came back to be a practicing Christian, I came back to the Assemblies of God tradition, which I didn't come back to. I came to the Assemblies of God tradition because that's where I went to school for my first year, and they did not have catechism. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't even a thought. Like, it was sort of, as the text sort of says, you know, like, there's the seeker who comes in, and if they show up, you know, 3 times, then they're now the new choir director. Like, would you like to teach Sunday school? Sure. So, you know, it was kind of like that. And that was actually one of the issues that some of the students, there was like an Orthodox Christianity club, like small O Orthodox, that talked about things like catechesis. And so that they were interested in that, but like just the main body of professors and students and other people in the congregation just weren't thinking about it. When I came back to Anglicanism,
Do you mind saying what was the content of Sunday school?
so Sunday school was kind of a mixed bag. We went to Central Assembly, which is like the Assemblies of God church in America, I guess. Like, it's right across the street from the headquarters. It's like their cathedral, if they could have a cathedral. And their Sunday school was this well-oiled machine that puts many kindergartens to shame. Like, they had, you know, color-coded rooms and like tags to drop off and pick up your kids. The lectures and like teachings started a little bit later, but there was like lots of coloring sheets that Emma would come home with. Emma's my daughter. Would come home with, like, this is Noah and the ark, you know, and then she'd color in the animals. Somewhat like that, you know, like what you would expect out of an elementary kindergarten program that uses like secular things, like these are how to color in the letters. But
Yeah.
she was coloring in like Bible stories. So sort of matching what our text said, you know, that kind of like specific familiarity or over familiarity with biblical stories, but no overarching like, this is what God means in the universe. With the Anglican Church, we came back in, we wanted to be confirmed, or I wanted to be confirmed, and Asami and my wife wanted to be received. So we had to do Anglicanism 101, which was a sort of catechetical course, I suppose. Talked a lot about like Anglican Church history, ecclesiology, and not a whole lot about like the main theological overtones. But that's just as the ACNA second printing of To Be a Christian was coming out. So that's the Anglican, the ACNA Catechism.
Yeah.
With an introduction written by J.I. Packer. And so I think the ACNA is really trying to push this, and I think that was sort of like their ground level, like trying to launch into catechism as a focus.
Yeah.
For new members. Yeah.
How long was your Anglicanism 101 class? Like how many
Not
sessions?
long. It was, I want to say 4 sessions. They were about an hour and a half each.
Okay.
So, I mean, that was decent length, I think. So, but not long enough.
Yeah.
Not like a full catechism, as you would expect. And I think that's changing now. They also, in between services, as an optional thing, had the old version of To Be a Christian, like verse by verse, like question 1, and then they spent 30 minutes talking about that and looking at the Bible references for it. But that was optional, and I dropped in on that once or twice, but not.
Okay.
Not very often. Yeah.
Cool.
That's pretty much my experience.
I muted you, Katie.
Oh, I just had a follow-up question, which was, so they clearly presumed when you did your confirmation preparation that you'd had probably some sort of baptismal preparation. So I'm just curious what your church's baptismal preparation looked like, if they had any.
The church that I was baptized in, the preparation was that I was born. And my parents turned to church. That was it, because I was baptized as an infant in Scotland.
And what about the Anglican? What about your ACNA church?
They didn't, well,
What would they do for an adult?
for an adult for baptism, I think it was the same course.
That 101?
That 101.
Okay. Jeremy, do you want to just come up here actually?
Yeah, that's probably
Okay.
the best way to do it.
Jeremy's going to come up here since he doesn't have a computer on him. He's a Luddite.
I actually am a Luddite.
Self-proclaimed.
Yes. So I was raised evangelical, and we didn't really do catechesis. It was a lot like Mark was talking about in the Assemblies of God. Lots of Bible stories, and I think they put a commodity on biblical literacy in a certain way, but it was not really connected to anything theological. They were just nice stories. So it's actually kind of a fun learning curve for me that, like, oh, it turns out that the Old Testament is actually related to something, Later, I joined the Reformed Church, which was a much more formal catechesis, Heidelberg Catechism and things like that. So, basic doctrine. Same with the Lutherans, very similar, and now the ACNA folks. So now there's.
I feel like you needed one more Continental Reformed Church in there. Just.
Yeah, I mean, there's. I've got the Magisterial Reformation covered, I think.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Maybe
Sky...
you join like the Finnish church or something, just for measure.
Yeah. So yeah.
Cool. Do you want to go next?
Sure.
Audrey?
Can you hear me? So I was also baptized as an infant, but not raised in the church. I found my way to church when I was a teenager to a little Episcopal church. I was confirmed there. I don't have a memory of ever attending a confirmation class, but I do have memories of going to a Wednesday night Bible study with 3 other teenagers, and this little lady would sort of instruct us and do Bible study with us, really informally. But I understood what I was doing when I was confirmed. So I don't know if maybe that was wrapped in there, or I'm just not remembering a formal class. And then as an adult, went to a number of churches that I worked in. But the last church I was in really has done, in my opinion, from the churches I've been at, has done the best job with catechesis at all levels. And the thing that I really appreciated was the department heads. We'd come together once a week for staff meetings, and as we would begin every season, the adult Sunday school classes, the children's Sunday school classes, and the youth Sunday school classes, we would all discuss what we were doing in tandem with each other, so that way families were holistically learning things sort of in the same scope, so it wasn't super disjointed. And I found that to be really valuable, because if you were maybe thinking about what you wanted to teach, or you didn't know what everybody else was doing, it was good to come together and sort of walk through that and see where there were spots that needed more attention, or maybe spots where everybody knows those Bible stories, but what about this? So, yeah, it was a lovely model. And I was actually talking about this last class. Since moving here, my oldest child, who's 8.5, she was catechized so well when we were at our sponsoring church, the church that we came from to come here. But since we've lived here, my youngest, she has really fallen behind as in comparison to where my oldest child is. And I know that a lot of that responsibility does fall on me as a parent. But when we go to church, when we've gone to churches here, it's been very much kids stay in church during service and they don't understand the sermon. It doesn't click with them. Or they get shuffled off to like daycare with coloring sheets. So that's all I got.
David, do you want to go on yours?
Okay. So catechesis, I remember Sunday school as early as 4. What I remember about my Sunday school experience was that it was, yes, a lot of Bible stories, the narratives, but always with the life lesson application. What do we derive from that about how we should live at the level of a child, obviously. I think a big part of my catechesis occurred at home. My parents did a Bible story with us every night, and we used the Bible and Picture for Little Eyes, which is a great Bible story book, but always ends with 3 short kind of life application kind of questions. And I think the doctrinal catechesis for me came through summer camp, church camp, starting in junior high. And then the Sunday school teachers I had from junior high onwards. We didn't really have youth group as a social activity. We had, youth Sunday school that didn't always occur on Sunday. Occurred other days of the week. I mean, what age group we were anyway. And so that's where we kind of brought our existential life questions and discussed them, with our peers and with our Sunday school teacher. And that's sort of where doctrine developed. I don't think it was, here's the doctrine, you have to receive it. It was more like, bring your life experience to what the church, what the scripture teaches, and let's do doctrine that way. That's how I remember developing for me.
John?
So for me, growing up,
You got unmute.
oh, sorry. Okay, hear me all right? Okay, so for me, growing up in kind of the progressive wing of the Episcopal Church, there was no catechesis. We would be taken to church by my parents and we would go, and because it was the family parish, we just kind of went there and smiled, nodded to what was coming out of the pulpit. So most of the catechesis was at home. And so my siblings and I, we had our children's Bibles. I remember the big DK one, which had all of the historical, context and, photographs of the Holy Land and explanatory little notes, which was, we were all weird kids, so we loved that. And so it was very much kind of nurtured in the home, and my relationship with my grandmother was very kind of rooted in faith and her experience of growing up in the Episcopal Church. And so it was this very much so familial thing. But by the time I was probably 10 or 12, my parents had kind of laxed in their praxis. And so I was the one who, that make them drive me to church, and I'd be going. And eventually, as I kind of realize I was kind of feeling not really spiritually nurtured that way in my teen years, and kind of drifted away from that eventually. So by the time I really kind of recommitted myself to my faith life when I was an undergraduate, and I was attending a parish, an Anglo-Catholic parish in Philadelphia, and how I kind of did my own catechesis, because again, they didn't have any kind of system left. They at one point did have very thorough catechesis, but just no one, they didn't know how to delegate authority. And so again, I kind of took it on myself to, dig around and find every tract and reading list that I could when I would do my work in the archives. And so most of my kind of formal training, as it were, was kind of self-led, even up through confirmation, because when I approached my priest about it, he said, "Oh, John, you're fine. We'll just get the bishop to lay hands on you." So, yeah, that's my experience. Thank you.
Cool. Do you want me to go as well? Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So I was raised in an Anabaptist tradition. Well, Anabaptist holiness. Mrs. Brown was my Sunday school teacher for many, many years, and she was amazing. It's funny. I feel like my memories of it are not super clear in that. I mean, I remember flannel graphs. I feel like I learned the Old Testament really well. We memorized a lot, and I found when I started preaching that I was surprised at how much of the Bible was in my head, and I think that has everything to do with Sunday school growing up. If I maybe didn't know exactly where it was, but I'd be like, oh, that's in Paul, or that's David, or whatever. So. Missions was a huge focus at my church, and so there would always be a missions conference every year and a full thing for the kids as well. That usually included setting up a room like an airplane, and we would travel to another place, and we would learn all about another place and everything. There wasn't really much in the way of doctrine that I can recall. I was pretty interested and precocious, so I think I learned theology from Narnia and reading C.S. Lewis. I don't think I read much more that was theological before I got to college, really. But yeah, so it was because of Narnia that I started reading other C.S. Lewis, and I found it very exciting and stimulating, and so then I read more.
So we've all talked a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of our catechesis process, and I found it really interesting that, is it Parrott? Is that how you say it? Parrott and Packer, in their introduction, they outlined some of the obstacles that they see to strengthening catechesis in the church. They outlined 3. They say there's this turn away from external authority, there's a resistance to authoritative instruction within the church, and preoccupation. And I was just curious to what degree those obstacles to catechesis sort of resonated with your own experience and what you've maybe observed in churches that you've attended, and whether you might add anything to that list.
Anybody? Yeah.
I very much so experienced. And
Are you logged in?
I was having trouble finding it.
Just open Google Meet.
Okay.
Are you logged in?
Unpopulated.
No. Just go to Google Meet, and if you're logged into your Nashota email, it will just be there.
Okay. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Maybe somebody else wants to jump in while John connects.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, so, am I making noise? Okay. I experienced a lot of this kind of pushback when I was with Assemblies of God seminary. And I noticed it sort of spoiled me to some of these ideas. like we were talking about this before class a little bit, but I was reading through the first chapter, and you get this kind of like historical narrative, which it was very common down there. It was like, there was Jesus, and then the early church, which is important because that's in Acts, and then some other stuff happened, which was good, and then Constantine came along, and then the Dark Ages happened, so everything was bad, and then Luther saved everything, and then shined the light back onto the church, and then this sort of progression. And that sort of led to this really negative view of church authority, of like the Roman Catholic Church, the church in the West, the whole, even to the point of saying, I had students in seminary who were saying things like Catholics aren't Christians yet. It's like, well, wait a minute. I think they were Christians first, so let's think back on that. But for them, like, if you couldn't find it in the Bible, like it just wasn't a thing. And so like church, this fear of tradition, like how can we look at this man-based tradition because it's based in humanity, so it's obviously flawed. We need to look at the scripture, and I think that led into the text's second chapter, really, which is like, well, look, it's biblical, guys, to kind of alleviate that fear, because that fear is very present. And I thought, I can't remember where it was, I highlighted it. Let's see. Yeah, so it was on page 30, but I'm reading in the Kindle version, so I don't know if it's the printed version. It's like, nevertheless, some evangelical churches may be hesitant about speaking of catechesis today, lest it should appear that they are being led by church tradition rather than Holy Scripture. Some churches are, for similar reasons, resistant to the use of creeds. We have likely all seen church bulletins or road signs outside church buildings proclaiming, "No creed but Christ, no law but love, no book but the Bible." And I have personal feelings about that kind of statement, but that seems to be that was the biggest roadblock. It was like, oh, anything that came out of tradition, that's flawed, and that's the church's authority oppressing people, so we need to get rid of that. So that narrative was very common and very popular, so I wouldn't know.
It's like an interesting kind of corollary, but it's similar, or foil rather. So like in my context, particularly I think historically, like when it was happening, so this is the early 2000s and the height of, the moral majority riding again. And I remember in our church, there was such a fear of being a fundamentalist. There was such a fear of aligning oneself with the politics of the religious right that Christian identity began to be seen as dangerous, as distraction from the ethics of Christianity, and keeping from doing good work. So Christian identity wasn't identified with the creed or personal relationship with God, but an ethical stance that just so happened to look like, the middle class, like liberal outlook on the world. And so it was very suspect, the idea of even being familiar with biblical texts. There was such like a pushback against church authority and against the written word. There was such a strong sense that being too Christian was dangerous, and that if the church moves beyond outside of its boundaries of being either a social club or a kind of pale version of social work, then it's not doing its job. And so if you're genuinely hungry to know God, to love Him, and also to serve your neighbor, those contexts, it's like they just don't have the vocabulary to understand it. Because if it's not coming from particularly like their political considerations, which seem kind of all-consuming, they just don't know how to talk about it.
Yeah. I'd say I don't remember hearing sort of anti-dogmatic preaching or teaching, you know what I mean, like against doctrine. But I think given that we were like Anabaptist holiness, I don't think that even sort of systematic doctrine was really even much of an idea. Like, I don't think it's just not really how even people thought about Christianity, that it might be a set of things that all relate to each other, that how you think about the church is actually related to how you think about Jesus, and, you know, those kind of things. It just never even occurred to me. I mean, I was so, like, I got to Wheaton and I met all these people who had been baptized as babies. And I was like, I thought that's what the Reformation was about. What? Like, I just didn't even have a category to put Protestants who baptized babies. I didn't know what to make of it. And I think it's then I started to realize, like, I don't think I actually know much of anything. Like, I know the Bible, but I don't know about, like, all this other stuff. And I didn't have a negative response to it. I was just like, I don't know. I hope I'll figure this out here.
I think an interesting, just correlating with your story, Father, like that's where I think in reflecting on my narrative of my catechesis, where like the home was so important, because you know we were also like reading Narnia, and then talking about you know how Aslan is Christ, and talking about that sort of thing. And I think this is probably revealing for me. I brought up my grandmother, where it was like she was kind of had the matriarch with the collective memory of how all of this kind of worked together. And so definitely like doctrine and dogma was seen as, you know, it's all interrelated. And then it felt like our church community just seemed so, they just couldn't even begin, like it felt like what was I was experiencing at home was so rich, and that like led me further and was encouraged at home, and then to be in a church community that felt so disinterested in that entirely. It was like the magic of Narnia, they had no time for that because they were too busy railing about how President Bush was going on about how God told him he needed to invade Iraq.
Yeah.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. So I was reflecting, so on my own experience, one of the pieces I was reflecting on that I was curious if anyone else resonated with was, so when I grew up, I also grew up Anabaptist, and my particular my particular location of the Anabaptist tradition also had a heavy anti-intellectual strain to it. So there was sort of this like, not only were we not creedal or not systematic, but there was also this sort of fear about being a little too studious about your faith. And so, you know, I had a father who was an economist, right? And so like, it was really hard for him. And I think that's why he sort of did an excellent job at home catechesis, because he sensed that there was this unwelcome, that any sort of effort to understand your faith with your mind was not welcome, because ultimately your faith was an exercise of the heart. And so I also wonder to what degree that was also a barrier, or is a current barrier, to deepening catechesis across the wider church.
Mm-hmm. David?
I mean, I think the danger is when you're dealing with people who are uncatechized or new to the faith, that you make the faith something only of the mind and not of the heart. And if I were to say that my experience of Episcopalianism has been anything, it has been an affair of the mind, not the heart. And that's a flaw that I don't want to take into my ministry.
Yeah. You know, there's lots of Episcopal churches that will have things like, you know, here you don't have to leave your brain at the door, or, you know, that kind of thing. And one of my, when I was at Marquette, there were a number of people who came from the Stone Campbell movement. And they were becoming more sacramental, so they were going to Episcopal churches. And I remember one of them joked, he was like, yeah, their bulletin says you don't have to leave your brain at the door. He's like, turns out it's kind of helpful, though, at least listening to the sermons. So the sort of irony was they played themselves up as being like so thoughtful, and it was actually like really shallow.
that was also my experience growing up, where it was this whole, you know, I mean, very, very East Coast, right? The thinking man's religion. You know, we're not like those other Protestants or like our Roman Catholic neighbors where they just, you know, smile and nod. But it was the exact same posture, right? Like it wasn't, or you would get pushback if you wanted to engage on that, and even priests too, you know, if you wanted to engage theologically, that was to ivory tower and see, I'm all about the people, you know, and yeah.
Yeah, can I? So on the whole, like intellectual piece, I think. So I posted a link to Bishop Robert Barron's thing on our whatever it's called, bulletin board. I don't know what it's called. I don't know if anybody had a chance to watch it, but in there he talks about this kind of atheist toolbook of like deconstructing this atheist street evangelism, kind of like going out and deconstructing people's faith and asking these questions. You know, it's very systematic questions. You know, like, you know, why do you believe in God? And then like picking apart the answer to like the depth of just where the person is like, you know, what percentage are you sure that God is real? And if they say 100%, then your mission is to kind of like shift them down to like 80 or 90%, right? Like as this like evangelical militant. And most of Bishop Barron's response is sort of like we're lacking this like intellectual tradition, right? Like if you go up, if some atheist on the street walks up to him, who's this extremely well-read person who like read Descartes when he was like 12 or something, and if you start arguing,
a little weird,
these
but
questions,
okay.
I mean, I wish I was reading Descartes and understanding it. That would be a lot. That'd be great. But you know, if you walk up even to any one of us here, you know, in this room, and you start asking these questions, like, well, how sure are you? Like, you know, are you 100% sure? And like, what's your experience? And like, couldn't a Hinduist have that experience too? And like, all these questions of like deconstructing the Christian faith as it is sort of taught in churches. It's kind of like, you know the Bible stories, but you don't know what it all means. And in his point of view, and I tend to agree, is that intellectual piece that's lacking there, and that catechesis to teach that, not being present is why so many people who are in the church currently are so susceptible to this sort of atheist attack. Of like, oh, you really think that the ark was a boat that held animals and stuff? And, well, yeah, and well, here's the empirical evidence of why that's not real. And then you go, oh, well, maybe the Bible's not true. And it's, you know how it's like it becomes this slippery slope of like just not having a solid foundation of intellectual tradition to stand on.
Mm-hmm.
But like what David said about getting too caught up in that, I think that's a danger as well. You know, because you know, religion in general is not a fully intellectual piece, but it needs to be emphasized, in my opinion, to have a strong importance. I mean, it's not maybe not primary, but it is important because you know the same thing. And I've met one of my friends tried to do this little atheist rundown too. His basic solution was that Christianity is good for people who are kind of weak-minded, who need like a little bit of structure to help boost them up, you know. But really, if you're intellectual, you can just manage yourself. You know, you don't need the church to tell you how to manage yourself. And it's like, okay, sure, but that's a really like post-scientific revolution, like what's the word? Sorry.
Enlightenment?
Yeah, not enlightenment, like material, like that's not the word I'm looking for, but it'll work. Like you can see it, taste it, touch it, so that makes it true. Empirical, yeah, that's it. It's like this empirical tradition of like, well, you can't touch God, so he must not be there. Let's intellectually like unwind it. And that seems to be like the battlefield that we're on, like the playing field that we're on, if you will. So like that's the game that people are playing. So if we're not able to play that game, then we're going to get destroyed.
I mean, the response to the touching question is like,
well,
have you come to the Eucharist?
Air.
Yeah.
There's also air.
It's
Right.
oxygen, yeah, I mean, yeah. You know what I mean. Maybe that was a bad example, but you know what I mean.
So Another tip I found really helpful in this book was how they broke down the kind of levels or categories of catechesis. So I think this might have also been an introduction, but they talked about how there's, there's one level of catechesis that's for inquirers or seekers. There's another one, there's catechesis proper, which is the preparation of children and adults for baptism or confirmation. And then there's the ongoing work of catechesis in maturing believers. And I was curious, do we find those categories helpful? In your own experiences, where has your church done that? Where did they place their emphasis? Where does the church which pieces of this do you think the church does well? Where are there gaps?
Whoa. One of the things that, again, I really valued from my last church that I did not see at the churches I was at before, was the time and space to actually get to know parishioners, and there were different options for different people. So there was, for example, there was one group called Seekers, Sinners, and Saints, which was a model of those that were mature, bringing in those that were seeking. And so it was almost like this, and this is an adult study, where they were helping to catechize one another under the guide of an instructor. There was also the Bible study specifically during the week for those that were trying to deepen their theological knowledge. So that one was a very mature Sunday school group that was actually led by the rector and assistant rector. And then we had Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, which was separated into ages and grades. And then we also had an additional Sunday school class that was a more generic for other kids that maybe weren't fitting into the catechesis model. Anyways, I could go on and on, but there were different things for different needs based off of the needs of the parish, not just what the church thought was a good idea to do, but actually tailored after the needs. Versus before, there was like a catch-all Sunday school that would follow the lectionary or follow whatever the volunteer of the day decided they should do. That's fine.
I just want to say that's really impressive. I'm like a big fan of Mother Betsy anyway, but now that I know that she was doing that, wow, that's really impressive.
Well, and that's why I just love her. That's why her church is growing. You know, there are, you go there and we have our person that greets all the new people, asks questions, and then instead of just like, oh, you should go to this classroom, it's, hey, let me introduce you to my friend so-and-so. And that friend says, hey, why don't you come with me today? And it's relational. It's about getting to know people and not just throwing everybody into the same bucket.
Yeah. I think Katie wanted to say something.
Yeah, so I was actually really curious about that, Audrey. I had two questions. One, is your church really, so growing up, I grew up in a church that was really intentional about pairing an older believer with a less mature believer. So I'm curious if your model, that was sort of an intentional thing that they did. And then two, my other question was, so these churches that do all the stages of catechesis really well, I'm always really curious about how churches get there. I mean, is it the vestry sits down? Is it something, a vision cast by the priest? Because to build out that kind of structure takes a lot of intentionality, and I'm always curious about how churches get to that point. So if you have any insights into that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, I mean, anybody doing that, it would be like the long game, right? I mean, it's not like you could do that in a year or something. So I'm interested about,
So I'm sorry. The first question was the mentoring. So our church just has built into our culture a mentoring mentality. You're always mentoring or you're being mentored. And it's not like you come into the church and they tell you this is how it is. It's just the culture. You find yourself in relationships. Like for example, my husband, we've been there for maybe 2.5 years and I worked there. But regardless, my husband got a phone call and was like, hey, we're wanting to connect younger men in the parish with older men in the parish. Would you be interested? And he was like, sure. Then he got a phone call and he made a friend and they would go to lunch together, and it was just, you know, just people connecting. We also did college ministry where you could mentor international college students that weren't always Christian, but you were like an American friend for them. And same thing with our youth students. We would pair them up with younger students, and so it was just part of the fabric of how we did things.
Do you have a sense of how it became that?
No, because I came in when this was already happening, and they were intentionally hiring people and putting leaders into leadership positions that fit into that culture. So I didn't get to see how it started, but I know that Father Bill Kavanaugh already had that going, and then bringing Mother Betsy in just helped to grow that intentional culture. And it's very relational.
That's a lot of, I mean, that's pretty incredible leadership. Because not only do you, like, that's a complicated system. I mean, like, even describing it, you imagine, like, you need a flow chart. Like, your staff meeting is like, you're thinking about all these, like, levels of things. Like, that's really impressive. I mean, and it does not seem like the kind of thing that, I don't know, like your average Episcopal priest is like managing that complex of a system.
We were pushed back on to manage our departments in that way. So they weren't micromanaging us.
Uh-huh.
It just happened organically. We would come into staff meetings, we would be given so much time each person, and we were expected to just weave into that.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Wow.
It was great.
Okay, let's say Mark and then John.
So on that relational piece, I think that's really key. I think to start there with that, building that culture of building relationships. I went to one of the Bible studies I went to when I was in the military. It's called Navigators. I think it's nationwide or whatever, but I was in Colorado Springs, which is their base. And one of the things that always struck me about that meeting was, first, we always felt like super welcome. And if I brought somebody with me that had never been to a Bible study before, they were very welcome. It was like a huge welcome to the group, and then almost maybe too aggressively, I thought at first. They were like, one of the more senior people in the group who had been there for a while, if you were new, would be like, hey, what are you doing after this? You want to go grab a coffee? Or like, let me get your number and we'll like set up like a time to go get a coffee. And it was like almost immediately like they wanted to reach out and make that connection with the new member. And it wasn't like have you heard the good news, kind of like let's go talk about the Bible right away. It was just like, let's just go meet and chat. And then if something about the Bible comes up or you have any questions, like I'm happy to field them. But like, let's have a coffee and get to know each other. And I think that's so foundational, that relationship building.
Yeah. John?
My question, I think, just like in seeing like the apparatus at Audrey's church, and I mean, like that, right? I think you're right. Like that is a seriously sophisticated apparatus of management and discernment and spiritual health
and vision.
And vision,
I mean,
right? But that's something where, and like you were saying, like most. I guess my question would be like, in my context, where often you have generations of like neglect, catechetical neglect, and you also need, I mean, just the administrative apparatus to pull that off. I mean, that's a level of sophistication that like, at least I know back home, like the majority of Episcopal parishes can't pull off anymore. So what do you do when you have, you know, like this, I'm in conversations about a potential position after graduation, and you have this tiny parish, maybe 8 people, 8 to 10 people in a former mission chapel. They have enough people in the vestry, historically black congregation in a now a white neighborhood, and they don't know what to do. And so my question would be like, how do you, this is a neighborhood and a Christian community that's been neglected by the diocese. They're not getting nice grants to build nice new things. They're really struggling. So what do you do in that kind of context where you don't have those sophisticated apparatuses, and you do have people around the block, people that I believe are hungry for God, hungry for Christ, need to know. And so where do you start, kind of like from the bottom up? How do you build those apparatuses, particularly when the people who are already in the community, and this is really common with Episcopal churches, are skeptical about outsiders and who don't want to integrate people into their congregations. Right? Because like that's all good when everyone has that vision.
Yeah.
But how do you even sell that vision and then develop the administrative apparatus to get it moving? Would be my question to us.
I think David had something. Can you unmute?
I've been thinking about this a bit for over the time I've been here because I really care about church growth. I don't know. You find 12 good people, and you spend 3 years with them, and you give them your vision. And I mean, I think that's what I think I'll have to do. Is find. There might not be 12. There might only be 5. I don't know. But you find 5 people that are willing to commit with you to what your vision is. And maybe you need to bring in a Matthew or a Simon the Zealot or one of those types from outside to also join this group, you know? Some disaffected person who's left the church that you know from your secular circle to be part of this, you know? We want to see what God can do in our community. And you have to catechize them in the vision. Like, this is not a matter of doctrine at this point. This is a matter of vision. This is what can we be as a church and how do we get there? And it may not end up looking like Audrey's church.
Yeah.
You know, it might be a church that's not built on Sunday school programs and an apparatus like that. It might be an apparatus that is social outreach to the community you're in. That starts and ends with a song of praise and a prayer. Outside in the yard, not in the sanctuary. And
Next to a broken tree.
next to a broken tree. I mean, you never know.
Yeah.
You know, you don't know where it's going to go. But man, you got to find that group of people because no leader can do it alone. And you got to impart your vision. And you don't impart your vision to hundreds of people at a time. You impart your vision to that core group that's willing to hang with you for time to do it.
I had a. Oh. Good.
I was gonna just add on to David's thoughts that the importance of maturing the small group you already have. I mean, because part of what a more sophisticated model is built on is the assumption you have mature believers. Because you can't have that immediate one-to-one with your priest necessarily. You're very dependent upon mature believers to disciple younger, less mature believers. And you can't do that unless you have a base of, so it seems to me that what we need to start with is maturing the small group that we have right in front of us. And so assessing what the needs of that group is and working with what you have. Because unless you build that foundation, there's no way you're gonna be able to grow beyond that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that may look like, you know, you have a group of 3 or 4 that you meet with weekly, where you pray together, you pray for them, and then you are like actively teaching through something and learning together and setting out, like telling them, like, this is what I'm doing. Like, I want you to help be leaders in this community, and this is how we're going to do this. We're going to work together, and yeah, I mean, you probably might have to do that for a year, you know, before you start any programs. Like, that's your program, is making Sunday happen, and maybe you can do one thing for your community during the week or something. Like, that might be all that is feasible.
After I graduated college, I was interning at a parish in a similar situation to the one I described. And like hostel vestry, maybe 25 people in the pews on Sunday. And the priest, I mean, it didn't work for a variety of reasons, but part of it was just trying to do too much at once, that the people weren't ready to get back on their feet. And they had been, you know, adversarial with the diocese, so any kind of like that, you know, either the canons or, you know, other priests tried to show the people were very skeptical of. And, you know, you had like just too much being thrown at them. That like what they probably needed was like small group meeting with the priest for a year. But I think like the temptation would be, you know, pushing them too far. So I think that, I mean, that's a dangerous thing too, right? If you're a priest in charge and you have a 3-year salary or a 3-year contract, and there's a limited amount of money, and you're trying to play the long game here, you know, how do you, I think that that's the temptation, right? Is, you know, you want to say, I want to deliver for these people and get them to a good start, but you do have to be so slow and so careful. I feel like.
Slow and careful like Jesus was?
Well, right, I mean, but that's...
I mean, how radical can you be? You know, we're going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And they're going to hate you too, and I want you to do this now. And that's what they did. It was successful.
But like, if people have been spiritually like abused and neglected, or whatever it is, like that you're gonna burn real quickly as a leader if you try to push too quickly.
Yeah.
And you're just gonna further the decline, I think.
Audrey has a hand here. Let me say one quick thing. I think along with not trying to do too much, and this is something I saw Thomas, Dr. Kincaid's husband, do really well, was that in the 2 little parishes he had, he just made sure that whatever they did was done really well. So that like their bulletin was as helpful to the newcomer as possible. That he was always super prepared. That people could always reach him. That people knew what was happening, even if it was just the 2 things. That no one could ever be like, I don't really know what's happening here. So just that, like, just getting even the little that you're doing is like going well.
It makes me think of Jesus, you know, saying, "Do you love me? Yes, then feed my sheep." He didn't say, "Invite all your friends, make sure you have the best program." He just simply said, "Feed my sheep. Fulfill the needs of the people that you are shepherding." And I feel like that's what the church I come from has done really well. I know we speak of sophistication and trying to get this like long-term plan, but it really did start grassroots. What do these sheep need? I need to feed them.
And I think related to that, I mean, you have Sunday morning is not like its first purpose is not catechesis, but you can, the Eucharist. But I think especially in this kind of context, you can make a plan about how to use your sermons, not just like every week, like, just fall into the gospel. But to actually look over the course of months and seasons and think about what is sort of basic Christian sort of doctrine that needs taught, or like these are the things that like mark Christians, or this is what a Christ, this is a sort of Christian vision of the world, or whatever, so that you're unbeknownst to them starting to actually form them, and they think they're just coming to Mass.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of blend together David and John's idea and say that for church growth, I'm very interested in church growth and church planting and missionary work as well. The idea of having like one good catechesis class and then one good outreach program, because you can't manage so much, right? If you're just starting and you have a small group, you have one good class with like, you have a core group of people and you're teaching them probably once a week, and that takes a while. And then an outreach to the community that lets people know that you exist and like who you are. And I've heard a bunch of creative ideas. Probably my favorite for this, it's Father Eric Raskoff's idea. I'm not sure. He spoke with a bunch of local farmers, and on the grounds of like tithing and the Jubilee, where we leave the edges of the fields clean, put together, which never happened because of coronavirus, but put together this idea of a free farmers market for the community, for people who are like hurting for money and they needed to get food. So kind of part of that feed the people ministry, and then just being present in that market as the people of the church. Like, this is presented to you by the church, and this is where we are. If you guys are interested, come by. This is kind of an instructional class that we have, etc. But not to push it too far, not to go out the complexity, but just one good outreach program, like you said as well, doing whatever you do really well. Educational section, which is like, this is what you need to understand what we do and who we are. And just like one of each, I think is manageable.
Okay, John?
So I just had my meeting with my sponsoring parish about my letter of recommendation for candidacy. So it was a little bit of an interview. And I took the opportunity to ask them, like, what do you, so I said, so I don't just fall into my own projects, you know, turning ministry into my own kind of vanity project. What do you guys expect? And it was good just to kind of hear boots on the ground, like what expectations were for this context. And it was honestly just something, reminding me of what you were saying, Father. It was something as simple as just show up, just be available, just be professional, you know, and know what's going on in our lives. You know, it was these kind of very basic things that you would think would be second nature to clergy, but like I've seen so much of that's just unheard of, you know. Being punctual, just being available, and just doing the job. You kind of basically one foot in front of the other. And like how vital that is to people, you know, being on time, whatever it is.
In terms of like building up something small, maybe one of the other things I saw Thomas do, and I'm biased here, but was upgrading the music as much as was possible in his financial situation, which was pretty limited. But I mean, I was surprised filling in this diocese a lot the first 3 years, just how atrocious, and I mean honestly atrocious, the music in lots of parishes was. And I just remember thinking, if you were not that religious and you came into this, like, that's a pretty big barrier to come over. You know what I mean? That you sort of have to bear with pretty awful music. And it seems like that's a reasonable goal to have, that your music should not be detrimental to your evangelistic sort of posture. Like, it doesn't need to be, we're not talking Jeffrey Williams level. We're talking, you just don't leave and think, church is great, but man, that music, whew, that's rough. You know, that seems a reasonable barrier. And he found somebody who could do better, and with the volunteer choir, gave them things at the very like edge of their capability, and everyone thought that like he had hung the moon. And so it also encouraged the congregation, because they realized like they could sing, because nobody sang before. Like everyone, it was so bad you couldn't even like follow the singing. So I think so that's a little 2 cents for me.
I'm curious. So they had the 3 levels of catechesis, all which are necessary. But I'm curious, like in a parish like John's, where there really isn't anything, do you have any? I guess I'm asking Father Olver, if you have any. Is it important to start with baptismal preparation? Is it? I mean, I know every congregation is different, but if you can't put your effort, if you can't do all those levels well, is there any sense of like is there a level we should be prioritizing, or type of catechesis that might be prioritized in an environment where it's really small, maybe you don't have a lot of mature believers? Where do you start?
Yeah. I don't think that's an easy question to answer. And I think that the reason it's not easy to, it's surprising to me how many Episcopal churches, their adult Sunday school consists of like what topic occurs to the priest that week or something, or like, you know, Bible in one hand, New York Times in the other, you know, let's talk about a relevant issue. Like, but I think something, I think that I would lean something that had a beginning and an end, and that was directly related to living as a faithful Christian. So something that had a practical payoff, but also something that was not just so open-ended that it felt like we're just going to keep sort of swimming in the deep end or something like that. So I think having something that is discrete in, sections or modules or something like that, might also be really helpful. Because I think that also helps with motivation for people to be involved. If it's just like this ongoing thing, Kristen went to this fundamentalist church at Wheaton that was preaching through Romans. I think they were in like year 8, and they were like in Romans 5. She was like, man, it was a lot of condemnation for like a year. She's like, I finally just couldn't take it anymore. Like we hadn't got to, there was no condemnation for those. It was just like condemnation. So, that's my first instinct. Yeah, is to maybe go that direction. And things that are going to surface basic Christian both teaching and living, and my sense is that like book studies, that you can do a lot better than just a book study, because I think if it relies on everyone reading and then just having a discussion, I think that can end up being really limited and shallow. So it requires the priest or whoever's teaching to come like with something substantive. Something to actually to offer. Yeah. John?
Do you think
Father,
that should that be done in a worship context? And I don't mean Sunday. So something that I've often thought, and this is slightly antiquated and anecdotal, but when I was at St. Clement's and doing archive work, they always had Friday night, and it was this later service, and it was even song of benediction with a sort of like catechetical sermon. And so it was this model, and they would do it beginning from fall all the way until summer.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something when we took church music with Father Pryor, he talked about was, lean into the offices, because they were, for a very long time, Anglican catechetical services.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can have, time for catechesis within the context of worship, but that doesn't require baptism. But
Right.
It's also sacramental if you have benediction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting model. I know that, I'm blanking on his name, who was the rector at St. Thomas Fifth Avenue. They used their evensong as they would like preach through certain things. So a series on the Ten Commandments, a series on Lord's Prayer, a series on Christian ethics, like things like that. My only maybe amendment to that would be, I think joining it to worship that is not overly burdensome, especially if that's outside of Sunday. That doesn't, it's like, man, you got to have 45 minutes in church to then go have the teaching. Like it maybe feels like a lot. I think that there's some value in having the teaching that is not within the liturgical context to allow for more familiarity. Because I do think, again, what Audrey was emphasizing was just how key the interpersonal piece was. So that instead of priest as like formal teacher, but as somebody that you can ask questions to and interact with, people feeling like they can actually connect with their pastor or priest seems to me important. And so I think having them, that's the context, but maybe you come down or you move into the hall or something and it's more casual and there's food, might help in that.
I have a question, and tell me if this is completely inappropriate. If you're praying the daily office, doing morning and evening prayer in the church, your times are scheduled, your congregation knows it, usually 2 or 3 people show up. Seems to me that's a perfect time, after you've read the lessons, to not just sermon, but discuss. I mean, spend 15, 20 minutes. What did you get out of this? Answer their questions, guide them, put it in the broader context.
Yep.
And then move on with the rest of the office of prayers. I mean, it's just ready-made. You pray the office by yourself, nobody shows up. One other person shows up. Discuss the scripture.
Yeah.
And there's no reason you can't. It doesn't have to be so stuck in, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the parish that sponsored me, another thing they just had a simple breakfast after their morning prayer and mass in the morning. And again, it was another community building thing that didn't require much of anyone, you know. They put on coffee and they had cereal, and that was it. But, and I think you could maybe use it even more than Father Duncan did, but especially if you're already doing it, if you can sort of add a hook and make it even more useful in building relationships or catechizing, then like it seems like why not?
You know, like when you were saying that, I was just thinking about, I don't know if anyone's ever been to like this kind of forced social kind of thing, but you go out to dinner and then they have like a little card with like questions on the table. And you're supposed to like talk about the questions, like, oh, you know, they don't have to be necessarily religious or whatever. But in that case, if you have like that sort of post-service breakfast, you know, you can have those little questions prepared. Like, so just in case you guys were interested, there's some speaking points on the table if you'd like to, you know, discuss. It might lead to like a fruitful thing, and then you could kind of move around the tables and see how people are interacting. And that's a kind of fun idea.
Audrey.
That just made me think of something I saw in a newsletter. So I have a problem. I get connected to churches and I get all their newsletters. So I have no idea which church it was from, but I know it was from the past 2 weeks. It could have been in Dallas, it could have been Wisconsin, I have no idea.
But it was a church.
It was a church, and there are people.
There you go.
And they're doing a,
Good job, Audrey.
Yep. Their women's group is doing, because there's been so much space from Corona, they're doing speed dating, where you have your 5-minute rotation with a set question, but it's spiritual in nature, and they're going to rotate through getting to know each other again, which you could do with people you've known 20 years. You know, there are things that you may not know about them. So that's a fun idea. That made me think of that.
And talk to each other 10 feet apart.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
John?
I think an interesting catechetical question. And again, I don't want to be too contextual here, but like that first level of like seeker thing is part of my fieldwork at Zion was we did Alpha, and I love Zion, and I love my time there. I love worshiping there and the community there. But when we did that, we were all doing it for people in the congregation already, people who are already catechized, people who have been worshiping at Zion their entire lives, and they're coming to the Alpha course, which is great to be revivified and to kind of get back to basics, as it were. But that kind of, I think for our context, like how do you get people in the door, right? And again, in like particularly in context where culturally people are a little bit more sensitive or maybe not disinterested, but a little bit more hostile, questioning of the church, right? And so how do you, in your average neighborhood, and I'm thinking particularly in an urban context, how do you get them in the door?
Yeah.
Is it that outreach piece? Is it that interpersonal connection piece? I don't know.
Yeah, it's I don't know if we want to if it's worth chatting about Alpha briefly. I mean, given that it's so huge, and it's used as, I think, that first level, right, of introducing the seeker. Maybe, I don't know, Katie, if you have experience with it, if you have thoughts about it, and maybe we can see if other people have found it useful, not useful, what's challenging, what's really helpful.
So so in Thailand, I actually oversaw our Alpha program, which is like, there's a Alpha Thailand. Alpha actually has lots of different national branches all over the world, and they try to contextualize the resources. I would say that they haven't done as great a job as I would hope. Our stuff still looked like they had just taken UK materials and dubbed it in Thai, so not great. So didn't do like a great job of addressing like a context where you have people coming from outside the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so that was maybe one of our biggest challenges. But the other thing that I found really challenging, and I think it's linked to this whole conversation, was that, when I took it on, I was new to the church, and so, they said, here's your small group leaders, go forth and, use them when you do, your breakouts. And my first time doing it, I pretty quickly found out that the level of catechesis that my small group leaders had was actually quite low. And so here they are trying to address like Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, like asking questions like, so when we die, do we all get absorbed back into God? And like, what do you believe humans are? Are they bodies? Are they souls? And and then you have these believers that have had very little catechesis themselves, and, so you're trying to jump in. And so I just realized that the alpha model, it has some real limitations, and one of those is that it has to be built on a foundation of really solid, catechized, small group leaders. And so somebody was saying, well, one of you were talking about how, at least when you started, you found that, I think it was John was talking about how people in the church who just came to Alpha. And actually, that's what we did. I had to pare way back and be like, okay, we can't even begin to launch this outside because we don't actually internally have the foundation to be offering this to outsiders. And actually I found that it was actually quite detrimental sometimes that I would hear people who were coming to us for baptism and had gone through Alpha, and the teachings that they had received from the small group, you had to re-catechize these people who had gone through Alpha, and then you had to pull.
You're like, no.
And why don't we have our own little coffee time, because we clearly have some issues we need to address. So so Alpha is great, I think, for what it does, but there are some, there's a lot of challenges to it, especially in an international setting.
Yeah. Audrey?
Of course, the new Teen Alpha that we did a couple years ago, I advocate for that so hard. It was one of the most successful programs I ran in my 10 years of my vocation. It worked as a massive evangelical tool where these students were able to bring people in and grow the youth group. It was amazing. But what we did is we picked intentional small group leaders that were catechized, that went through training beforehand, and also we split our small groups into levels of catechesis. So kind of the same thing that we had done at the church as a whole, we had 5 different small groups based off of gender and level of faith. Mm-hmm. And it was a really healthy model that worked amazing with the Alpha program.
I've always wondered what Catholic Alpha is like, because when I have gone through Alpha, when I've participated in it, I remember thinking, there's no church here. Like, the church is absent, so that coming to Jesus, it seemed like being part of the church or going to church, it felt really disconnected, and thus the sacraments and everything. So maybe I'm sort of wanting it to do more than it's possible to do in. But I wondered what Catholic Alpha did, because I know that's actually quite large as well. In what way they have amended it or not? Does anybody have any experience? Anybody know?
I think the interesting dimension of that, right, is because you have to kind of rewrite it. Then it's almost like there are 2 tiers of an Anglican catechism. Right? One come to Jesus, one, I'm preparing you for the sacrament. And that's really bad. Right? You don't want to, or you want those to be interwoven, right? Because that should be rooted, they should be so rooted together.
Yeah.
I would feel like they should be.
But, yeah. So now I'm sort of wondering, But maybe then, you have Alpha, and then you have something else that's sort of return again to basic Christian doctrine that also sort of shows you how this is related to like the church and how we live and that kind of thing as well. Because Alpha has a relatively narrow focus and purpose.
Well, with that, using it as a tool, so the last time that I ran it, the way that I set up the model was just like what you said. It was very narrow and it had a specific purpose, but the overall time we were together, there was also a lesson and a time the whole group was together and we addressed those sorts of big, big theme ideas or the hard questions that what does happen to your spirit when you die? So that it was in a large group setting and not in a closed room with somebody that.
Katie, thank you so much. I know this was slightly awkward, but I think it went well, and we were all able to hear each other, so that's key. We could see you, that was key. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Checks with blocks come, checks with bricks and blocks and clocks come. Looks, Mr. Knoxer, let's do tricks with bricks and blocks.
Sorry, Dave, this is just...
It's hilarious. It's good.
This guy's from Milwaukee, too.
Yeah, actually, I vacuumed both halves of the
So
basement.
that parasite
So
that I
if you
brought
want to
up,
leave it, so I'm supposed to do that every other week.
that I've been kind of in discussion with my guys about.
Yeah.
My current project is like drafting a proposal of